If you're a landlord who lets to students, the world as you know it will change when the Renters' Rights Bill comes into effect, likely in 2026. And this is because many of the fundamental assumptions that are there in your business case, your business model, will change when it comes into effect. You need to understand exactly what the Renters' Rights Bill will mean for your business so you can decide how you're going to adapt in the brave new world after the Renters' Rights Act comes into force. In this video, I'm going to explain exactly why the Renters' Rights Bill is set to change the business model of landlords who let to students for both HMOs and on a single let basis. And stick around to the end, as I'm also going to share the strategies that landlords are planning to use to minimise the downside as much as possible. And who am I? I'm Suzanne Smith, lawyer turned landlord, and I run the Independent Landlord.com website and this YouTube channel to bring reliable, balanced guidance to everyone in the private rented sector. And you can look at the blog version of this video at theindependentlandlord.com/renters-rights-students. I'm recording this video at the beginning of June, and I'm using the draft of the Renters' Rights Bill that was published on the 15th of May of this year. And so, depending when you listen to this, the bill might have changed a little bit since then. Right, let's start with the current business model for letting to students so we can understand which bits of it are important and how they're going to be affected by the Renters' Rights Bill. So here are the foundations of the business model at the moment. The first one is joint tenancies. Unless it's a single let to a single student, then what normally happens is a group of students will normally sign a joint tenancy. And this means that they're jointly and severally liable for the entire rent for the fixed term, something that mirrors the academic year. And the advantage of this for landlords is that if one tenant moves out during the year, there's an incentive for the tenants to try and find somebody else because they're still going to have to be liable for the rent until the end of the fixed term period. The second one is void periods. The fixed term tenancy will normally run for 10, 11, 12 months, even though the academic year for undergrads is about 8 or 9 months. And students might return home after their exams in May or June, and they'll still have to keep paying it until the fixed term runs out in August, for instance. So this structure allows landlords to receive income over the summer months, and this reduces void periods when the property's empty. And landlords time it so that one group leaves in late summer and the other one moves shortly afterwards, after a little break for any maintenance. And so they move in, they have certainty they're going to move in at the start of the academic year, and the gap is knowable for the maintenance and redecoration, and it's kept to a minimum. But because the landlords know when it's going to be, they can schedule it with the various trades. And so this business model relies on the predictable churn of new tenants every year and the ability to keep the property occupied with paying tenants and keeping void periods short and working around when work has to be done. The third one is signing up students early. Landlords normally market properties in the late autumn or the winter for the following September, and they like to sign up groups of students for the following academic year. And this is good for landlords as they can secure tenants well in advance of the start date when the pool of tenants is big. However, it's less good for students whose friendship groups might still be changing, and they might have changed a lot by the start of the next academic year. The next one is mitigating the risk of rent arrears. So landlords will normally ask for a guarantor, which is usually a parent, for each student tenant, and that gives the landlord confidence that the rent will be paid. And for international students without a guarantor in the UK, landlords will normally ask for the rent to be paid in advance so that they know that the student won't run up rent arrears and leave the country. Let's now talk about how the Renters' Rights Bill will disrupt the business model for landlords. Well, first of all, the bill will introduce a new periodic assured tenancy system that will abolish fixed terms, with tenants being able to leave at any time with 2 months' notice. And so this is going to change the fundamentals of letting to students. So the abolition of fixed terms means that there'll be no certainty over how long a group of students will remain in a property, as the tenancy will roll from month to month. And tenants will be able to terminate a tenancy at any time by giving the landlord 2 months' notice to quit, which has to coincide with the end of a rent period. And so landlords will face less predictable lets and longer void periods, as many students will want to move out as soon as they can after the end of the second term, so before Easter. Although there will be some exceptions, like PhD students and master's students who want to stay there for the full year. And other students would want to stay in Airbnbs over the short exam period to avoid having to pay full rent for a couple of months or 3 months even. And it's going to be a lot harder for landlords to be able to plan work, as they won't be able to know exactly when the students are leaving. So these void periods are going to be very variable, and it's going to be difficult to plan. Also, another practicality is that landlords may need different insurance if the property is unoccupied. And because rent periods can no longer be more than 1 month, landlords won't be able to ask tenants to pay rent in advance or several rent periods in advance. And there won't be any longer the benefit of having a joint tenancy, because if one joint tenant wants to leave and they serve notice, it will bring the tenancy to an end for everybody. And there's not going to be that incentive for the remaining group to find somebody else. And if students want to leave throughout the year, it will be hard for the landlord to find another student tenant until the start of the next academic year. I mean, there might be some people who want to move in over the summer for work experience or for short courses, but that's a lot fewer numbers of people than who want to actually take a property to rent a room for a whole year. Also, full-time students don't pay council tax. And if there's a protracted void period when the entire property is empty, the landlord will need to pay the full council tax. And some councils charge more council tax when a property is empty because it's a second home. So, what's the government's stance on this? But during the debates in Parliament, many have argued for an exception to be made for student tenancies, so they can still have a fixed term, to recognise that student tenancies are different from an ordinary single let to families. But the government has been adamant that they do not believe it is right for students to have less flexibility than other landlords. For instance, let's listen to what the Minister, Baroness Taylor, said in the committee stage of the House of Lords.
It wouldn't be either right or fair for students to have less flexibility than other tenants just because of their educational status. Students who drop out of university could be required to pay rent for the rest of the fixed term, which could potentially reach thousands of pounds. All renters, including students, should have access to the benefits provided by the bill.
And it's not just the structure of the new assured tenancy that will change the model, but there are lots of complicated rules about rent. And the biggest one is the banning of rent in advance, because about a quarter of students in the UK, so that's almost 750,000 individuals, are from outside of the UK. And the top sending countries are India, China, and Nigeria. And the government's own figures say that international students added almost 22 billion to the UK economy in 2021. And it's likely to have gone up since then. If you remember, 2021 was still COVID. And landlords normally ask international students to pay rent in advance if they don't have a UK guarantor or assets in the UK. And because this reduces the risks of students leaving the UK at the end of their studies with rent arrears, which are difficult for landlords to do anything about. However, the Renters' Rights Bill will remove the ability of landlords to ask for rent in advance for international students, well, for all students or for anyone. And so the risk of letting to properties to the significant proportion of the student population that is international students will increase. So maybe landlords will be able to ask the students to take out professional guarantor insurance, because tenants won't be able to circumvent the ban on rent in advance by putting money in an escrow account or giving it to somebody else to pay. And so it seems that the only way that landlords will be able to mitigate this risk is by asking for a UK guarantor or a professional guarantor. And there are companies that are offering this already. It's good business, I guess, for somebody, all of these rules. The next change is the new rule that says that rent periods can't be longer than a month. Whereas at the moment, students might prefer to pay on a termly basis or a quarterly basis, whatever, to dovetail with the money that they receive from grants or from something else. At the moment, you can accommodate that if you're a landlord, but you're not going to be able to in the future, because every rent period will have to be no more than a month, and there can't be a contractual obligation in the tenancy agreement that says that the tenant must pay multiple periods in advance. And also, you can't have it so you've got six big rent periods, 6 big rent amounts, and then the rent for the rest of the time is less to encourage them to stay there over the summer. You can't do that either, because that's a breach of the Tenant Fees Act, or will be. There's been much talk about the new ground 4A for full-time students and HMOs, but there's a lot of hoops that landlords we're going to have to jump through, and some are even wondering whether it's worth the hassle. So at the moment, most students move out at the end of the year. It's very rare for a landlord to serve a Section 21 notice, because there's that fixed term tenancy, and students tend to move out at the end of it. But the Renters' Rights Bill is introducing a new ground 4A into the Section 8 regime that will allow landlords to obtain possession of a property if it's been let to full-time students and they want to let it to another cohort of full-time students. But it's very narrow, and there are lots of steps that the landlord needs to follow. First of all, the tenants or the applicants must meet the student test. So they must be students, full-time students on a big list of education courses. And the landlord must have reasonably believed at the start of the tenancy that the students would either meet that test, or already meet the test, or will meet the test. So if they're starting a new course, they'll need to be comfortable that they're actually on a course. And the landlords will need to serve at least 4 months' notice, which can only expire from the 1st of June to the 30th of September. And landlords will need to have provided a written statement in advance that they would wish to do this. And also, landlords, and this is really important, won't be able to use this if they signed up the tenants more than 6 months in advance. So if the landlords recruit the tenants in October or November and they want them to move in August or July, then they can't use a ground for 4A, because it's more than 6 months before the start of the tenancy that they sign them up. And so the upside for using the ground 4A, i.e. that you'll be able to evict the tenant, the student, at the end of the academic year, assuming that the courts aren't slow. So that's the upside. And people are saying that's actually not worth it, because the downside is that you'll have to delay signing up the new students. And some landlords would rather continue being able to sign up tenants early before Christmas, when the pool of the tenants, of the prospective tenants, is as large as possible, particularly in the university cities where there's a lot of purpose-built student accommodation. So there's a lot of competition, a lot of supply. And if landlords don't use this ground 4A, they're going to have to be very careful about how they communicate with tenants to say that they need to move out at the end of the academic year. In fact, they're not going to be able to say that, because it will be an offence to purport to serve a notice to quit. And that has attached to it a civil penalty of up to £7,000. And it's also likely to become very messy for landlords without the certainty of set void periods to be able to carry out work on improving properties, which, often they get a high lot of wear and tear, and the landlords need to schedule work in the void period. And it's going to be difficult for them to be able to say with any certainty that the property will be clear by a certain date, because there's not going to be the easier Section 21 notice. So let's get to the nitty-gritty of what landlords who currently let to students are intending to do to reduce the risk and challenges that the Renters' Rights Bill is likely to bring. So I'll run through them now. First of all, landlords are thinking of changing the start date of student tenancies to June or July instead of August or September, so there won't be a void over the summer period. The next one is letting HMOs, student HMOs, by the room instead of as a joint tenancy, because this will avoid the risk that one tenant will serve notice to quit for all, and reflecting the fact that there'll be fewer advantages to joint tenancies in the future. This will, however, increase administration costs for the landlord, and it will be a lot more hassle, and the extra costs will be passed on to students. Also, letting by the room might reduce the cohesiveness of the group in the house, leading to higher turnover, although it can sometimes work well when people who don't know each other move in together. Another approach is to delay the annual recruitment of students to January to keep the benefit of Ground 4A. But opinion really is divided among landlords as to whether it's worth it, because the downside of not being able to sign tenants up early might not outweigh the benefits of being able to have a Ground 4A. Some landlords are thinking of switching to a serviced accommodation model, whereby the tenants don't have exclusive possession. But instead, they will have what's called a license to occupy. And as a result, the let would be outside of the Housing Act 1988, and it won't be an assured tenancy. And the landlord could provide services like Airbnb, for instance, weekly cleanings in the rooms and linen. However, this will increase the cost for landlords and would be open to claims that it's a sham designed to circumvent these new rules. And so landlords taking a license to occupy approach, unless it really is genuinely a bit like a hotel, it will leave themselves open to considerable penalties. And the local housing authority will have a lot of rights to obtain documents and even enter the premises without a warrant to see if there's been any breaches. Another approach is to increase the monthly rent to reflect a shorter likely tenancy. This would be a disadvantage to postgraduate students who stay at the university all year round. Another idea is to let rooms as short-term lets over the summer on platforms like Airbnb. So if everybody moves out, or even if most of the people move out after Easter, then over the summer period, they can let it as Airbnb on very, very short-term contracts. And that might be useful in some of the cities where there's a lot of tourists over the summer. This is a lot more work for the landlord, as it's like running a mini hotel with management, cleaning, bed linen, and communicating with guests, plus the fees payable to the various platforms. I used to do Airbnb for a short period with my accidental landlord flat, and I gave up after 10 months, even though I had a manager doing it, because it was a complete and utter hassle, very high wear and tear. But of course, this will be subject to any licensing requirements, and it's likely to be unpopular if any of the students are remaining in the property over the summer. Another approach is to stop letting to students at all and to move to HMOs for professionals, or to turn it into a proper Airbnb subject to planning. And some landlords are even thinking of switching to letting it to single households who intend to stay for the long term. A lot of this will depend just how big the HMO is, whether it's subject to mandatory licensing or planning, if it's in an Article 4 area. So all of those do have a lot of complications with them. And the final one is selling up, because if the model doesn't stack up anymore, and maybe it's best to sell up. And a lot will depend on your individual circumstances and what you're looking for in terms of return from your investment in student property. So after all that, it's like doom and gloom. Is there an upside? Because it all sounds very depressing. However, it's not all bad news unless you're a student, because I don't think that students are going to benefit from these rules. They're the ones that are going to have less availability of houses, properties that aren't purpose-built student accommodation, and they're going to have less certainty over the whole process. But for those landlords who do decide to continue letting to students, there's unlikely to be a drop in demand. Far from it. With the more landlords who stop specialising in students, the more demand there'll be from those students who do not wish to live in purpose-built student accommodation or where it's not available. PBSA is not for everybody. And there's been much talk about the unintended consequences of the Renters' Rights Bill. And whilst I understand that students don't want to pay to live in somewhere when they've moved out, the landlord's fixed costs won't go away, and some variable costs increase during voids. And there's also the practicalities of messy void periods when students will have less certainty over their start dates, and it'll be hard for landlords to plan refurbishment and improvement works in the voids between different groups of students. And I think it's entirely predictable that many landlords will either abandon the student sector or take one of the other mitigation strategies that I've gone through. And this won't be good for students. So the Renters' Rights Bill has still some significant steps to complete before it receives royal assent. And it is possible that some of the detail will change. We can only hope. But things might move really quickly in the coming months. And you can keep up to date by signing up for my free weekly newsletter at theindependentlandlord.com/subscribe. And if you found this useful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. You can check out this video here, which explains the Renters' Rights Bill in under 10 minutes, and this playlist here, where I put new content on the Renters' Rights Bill all the time. See you soon.